So imagine this. A man with one foot planted firmly in a world of ancient tradition and divine law, and the other stepping right into a brand new age of scientific reason and radical ideas. This was the world of Rabbi David Nieto.
On one hand, you've got this timeless world of rabbinic Judaism, but on the other, you've got the absolutely electrifying atmosphere of the scientific Enlightenment. Today, we're going to explore how one brilliant rabbi navigated the London of Isaac Newton and John Locke, and how he used the tools of that new world to actually defend the old one.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start in Enlightenment London, get to know Rabbi Nieto, and really understand the super fragile community he was hired to lead. Then, we'll dive right into the two huge crises he faced, the whole God versus nature debate, and that deep skepticism his own people had about the Oral Torah. And then, we'll wrap it all up by looking at his unique legacy.
All right, so let's set the scene. We're starting with the city itself. And look, this wasn't just any city. At the time, London was basically the intellectual capital of the world.
So when Rabbi Nieto shows up in London in 1702, he's not just walking into a new city. No way. He is walking straight into a revolution in human thought. I mean, think about it. Isaac Newton had recently published his Principia, the book that laid out the universal laws of motion. John Locke was totally reshaping how people thought about government and the human mind. This place was just buzzing with questions, where old, comfortable certainties were being challenged every single day in coffee shops and lecture halls.
So, who was this guy? Who was this man who was so uniquely equipped to face this intellectual storm?
David Nieto was a total product of the European Renaissance. He was born in Venice, grew up in Livorno, another huge center of Sephardic life. But here's the crucial part. He went to the University of Padua. Now, this was one of the very few universities that would even admit Jews, and he trained there as a physician. So right away, this isn't just a religious scholar. This was a man who was already steeped in classical and scientific learning long before he ever set foot in England.
And his expertise was just incredibly diverse. I mean, of course he was a rabbi and a religious judge, but he was also a physician, an astronomer who knew his math inside and out, a philosopher, and even a poet. The guy was a true polymath, He was completely comfortable in both the world of faith and the world of science. And it was this unique combination that made him the perfect person for a community that was facing a real crisis of belief.
Okay, so what kind of community are we talking about here? I mean, who exactly hired him? Because this was not your typical, long-established congregation. You see, the Jewish community in London was pretty new and honestly pretty fragile. Most of its members were what we call conversos. These were descendants of Jews from Spain and Portugal who had been forced to convert to Catholicism. We're talking about people who had lived as Christians for generations. Many of them were just now coming back to Judaism, showing up in London with very, very little knowledge of its traditions. Okay, and this slide. Wow. This quote from historian Matt Goldish just perfectly captures the identity crisis they were facing. He says a member of the synagogue's governing board, the leadership, was going to synagogue on Saturday and then to church on Sunday. Think about that. This wasn't just ignorance. This was a deep-seated skepticism about the very foundations of the religion they were supposedly re-embracing. And that skepticism, it was aimed right at the heart of rabbinic Judaism, the Oral Torah. To them, coming from this Christian background that focused only on the written Bible, this whole idea of an oral tradition just felt, foreign, maybe even something the rabbis just made up. And this was the core problem Rabbi Nieto was brought to London to solve. So, his first big test didn't even come from inside his community. Nope, it came from the huge philosophical question of the Enlightenment that was just sweeping through London. The question was simple, but absolutely explosive. In a sermon, Rabbi Nieto said that nature is just the way God acts in the world. Seems straightforward, right? But his wording was dangerously close to a really radical heretical idea that was floating around, and it immediately sparked a total firestorm. And this right here brilliantly illustrates the whole controversy. See, the philosopher Baruch Spinoza had argued for something called pantheism, the idea that God is nature, that they're one and the same thing. At the time, this was considered complete and utter heresy. So Nieto's own congregants accused him of being a Spinozist, but his position was totally different and traditionally Jewish. He was arguing that God causes nature. Nature isn't God itself. It's more like God's modus operandi, the system of laws and processes he created to run the world. A subtle difference, but a hugely important one. Man, the accusation of heresy was so serious that Nieto actually wrote a whole book
on divine providence just to clarify his position. The whole thing eventually got sent to one of the most respected rabbis in the world at the time, Hakam Zevi Ashkenazi, who completely sided with Nieto. He praised his intellect and totally cleared his name. So what happened here? Rabbi Nieto used philosophy to defend faith, and he won.
All right, so with his own theological position now secure, Nieto turned his attention to that deeper, internal crisis that was threatening his community from the inside out.
So, like we said, his congregation was super skeptical of the Oral Torah. And look, this wasn't some minor detail. This is the very foundation of rabbinic Judaism. It's the tradition that explains, how to actually keep the Sabbath, what makes food kosher, how you interpret biblical laws for daily life. Without it, their whole return to Judaism was basically incomplete.
So what does he do? He writes his masterpiece, Mateh Dan, which is also called the Second Kuzari. And it was designed as a direct appeal to his skeptical, university-educated congregations. He wasn't just going to ask them to have faith. No, he was going to build a logical, compelling, almost scientific case for why the Oral Torah was absolutely authentic and necessary.
He structured the book as 5 dialogues, laying out his argument piece by piece. First, he argued that any legal text, any written law, needs an oral tradition to make sense of it. But then, he did something perfectly tailored to his audience. He dedicated 2 whole sections to showing off the sages' deep scientific knowledge. He didn't just say they were smart, he proved it. For instance, he showed how their calculations for the lunar month were so ridiculously precise that they rivaled the top astronomical findings of his own day. See what he's doing? This wasn't an appeal to blind faith. This was him presenting cold, hard, empirical evidence of an ancient, sophisticated wisdom.
And his argument was also intensely practical. Take the Sabbath. The Bible says, do not work on the Sabbath. Okay, great. But what exactly is work? Does that mean flipping a light switch? Carrying your keys? He pointed out that without the detailed definitions that you only get from the Oral Torah, the most basic commandments would be literally impossible to follow. He made this abstract idea of tradition feel immediate and just common sense.
So after all that, what's the big takeaway here? What was Rabbi Nieto's lasting impact on Jewish thought?
Well, historians see him as a key figure in what's now called the conservative Enlightenment. You see, unlike the radicals who wanted to just throw tradition out the window, Nieto was part of a movement that believed reason and faith could and should work together. He didn't reject modernity at all. He engaged with it, but on his own terms.
And really, this is his ultimate legacy. He was a bridge. He looked at the telescope, at the new philosophies, at this new spirit of rational inquiry, and he didn't see threats to Judaism. He saw tools. He used logic, he used science, he used rigorous argument to show a really skeptical generation that their ancient faith was not only compatible with the modern world, but was itself intellectually profound and rationally defensible.
So, Rabbi Nieto's struggle from 300 years ago leaves us with a question that feels more relevant today than ever. When new science and ancient tradition seem to clash, do we really have to pick a side? Or is it possible to follow his example and see both as pathways to an even deeper truth?